This is section 114 of Newspaper Articles by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Newspaper Articles by Mark Twain, section 114, The Galaxy, July, 1870. Memoranda by Mark Twain. The Tournament in A.D. 1870. Lately there appeared an item to this effect, and the same went the customary universal round of the press. A telegraph station has just been established upon the traditional site of the Garden of Eden. As a companion to that, nothing fits so aptly and so perfectly as this: Brooklyn has revived the nightly tournament of the Middle Ages. It is hard to tell which is the most startling, the idea of that highest achievement of human genius and intelligence, the telegraph, prating away about the practical concerns of the world's daily life in the heart and home of ancient indolence, ignorance, and savagery, or the idea of that happiest expression of the brag, vanity, and mock heroics of our ancestors, the tournament, coming out of its grave to flaunt its tinsel trumpery and perform its chivalrous absurdities in the high noon of the 19th century, and under the patronage of a great, broad-awake city and an advanced civilization. A tournament in Lynchburg is a thing easily within the comprehension of the average mind, but no commonly gifted person can conceive of such a spectacle in Brooklyn without straining his powers. Brooklyn is part and parcel of the city of New York, and there is hardly romance enough in the entire metropolis to resupply a Virginia knight with chivalry in case he happened to run out of it. Let the reader calmly and dispassionately picture to himself lists in Brooklyn, heralds, pursuivants, pages, garter king-at-arms in Brooklyn, the marshalling of the fantastic hosts of chivalry in slashed doublets, velvet trunks, ruffles and plumes in Brooklyn, mounted on omnibus and livery-stable patriarchs, promoted and referred to in cold blood as steeds, destriers, and chargers, and divested of their friendly, humble names, these meek old Jims and Bobs and Charlies, and renamed Mohammed, Bucephalus, and Saladin, in Brooklyn, mounted thus and armed with swords and shields and wooden lances, and cased in pasteboard hauberks, morions, greaves, and gauntlets, and addressed as Sir Smith and Sir Jones, and bearing such title grandeurs as the Disinherited Knight, the Knight of Shenandoah, the Knight of the Blue Ridge, the Knight of Maryland, and the Knight of the Secret Sorrow, in Brooklyn, and at the toot of the horn charging fiercely upon a helpless ring hung on a post, and prodding at it intrepidly with their wooden sticks, and by and by skewering it and cavorting back to the judges' stand covered with glory. This in Brooklyn, and each noble success like this duly and promptly announced by an applauding toot from the herald's horn, and the band playing 3 bars of an old circus tune, all in Brooklyn, in broad daylight. And let the reader remember, and also add to his picture, as follows, to wit: when the show was all over, the party who had shed the most blood and overturned and hacked to pieces the most knights, or at least had produced the most muffin-rings, was accorded the ancient privilege of naming and crowning the Queen of Love and Beauty, which naming had in reality been done for him by the cut-and-dried process, and long in advance, by a committee of ladies, but the crowning he did in person, though suffering from loss of blood, and then was taken to the county hospital on a shutter to have his wounds dressed. These curious things all occurring in Brooklyn, and no longer ago than 1 or 2 yesterdays. It seems impossible, and yet it is true. This was doubtless the first appearance of the tournament up here among the rolling mills and factories, and will probably be the last. It will be well to let it retire permanently to the rural districts of Virginia, where, it is said, the fine mailed and plumed, noble-natured, maiden-rescuing, wrong-redressing, adventure-seeking knight of romance is accepted and believed in by the peasantry with pleasing simplicity, while they reject with scorn the plain, unpolished verdict whereby history exposes him as a braggart, a ruffian, a fantastic vagabond, and an ignoramus. All romances aside, what shape would our admiration of the heroes of Ashby de la Zouch be likely to take in this practical age, if those worthies were to rise up and come here and perform again the chivalrous deeds of that famous passage of arms? Nothing but a New York jury and the insanity plea could save them from hanging, from the amiable Bois Guilbert and the pleasant Front de Boeuf, clear down to the nameless ruffians that entered the riot with unpictured shields, and did their first murder and acquired their first claim to respect that day. The doings of the so-called chivalry of the Middle Ages were absurd enough, even when they were brutally and bloodily in earnest, and when their surroundings of castles and donjons, savage landscapes and half-savage peoples, were in keeping. But those doings gravely reproduced with tinsel decorations and mock pageantry by bucolic gentlemen with broomstick lances, and with muffin rings to represent the foe, and all in the midst of the refinement and dignity of a carefully developed modern civilization, is absurdity gone crazy. Now, for next exhibition, let us have a fine representation of one of those chivalrous wholesale butcheries and burnings of Jewish women and children, which the crusading heroes of romance used to indulge in their European homes, just before starting to the Holy Land, to seize and take to their protection the sepulchre and defend it from pollution. The Galaxy, July, 1870. Memoranda by Mark Twain. Unburlesquable Things. There are some things which cannot be burlesqued, for the simple reason that in themselves they are so extravagant and grotesque that nothing is left for burlesque to take hold of. For instance, all attempts to burlesque the Byron scandal were failures because the central feature of it, incest, was a situation so tremendous and so imposing that the happiest available resources of burlesque seemed tame and cheap in its presence. Burlesque could invent nothing to transcend incest except by enlisting two crimes, neither of which is ever mentioned among women and children, and one of which is only mentioned in rare books of the law, and then as the crime without a name, a term with a shudder in it. So the reader never saw the Byron scandal successfully travestied in print, and he may rest satisfied that he never will. All attempts to burlesque the monster musical Peace Jubilee in Boston were mournful failures. The 10,000 singers, the prodigious organ, the 100 anvils, and the artillery accompaniment made up an unintentional but complete, symmetrical, and enormous burlesque, which shamed the poor inventions of the sketchers and scribblers who tried to be funny over it in magazines and newspapers. Even Cruikshank failed when he tried to pictorially burlesque the English musical extravaganza which probably furnished Mr. Gilmore with his idea. There was no burlesquing the situation when the French train Henri Rochefort brayed forth the proclamation that whenever he was arrested 40,000 ouvriers would be there to know the reason why, when alas, right on top of it one single humble policeman took him and marched him off to prison through an atmosphere with never a taint of garlic in it. There is no burlesquing the McFarland trial, either as a whole or piecemeal by selection, because it was sublimated burlesque itself, in any way one may look at it. The court gravely tried the prisoner, not for murder, apparently, but as to his sanity or insanity. His counsel attempted the intellectual miracle of proving the prisoner's deed to have been a justifiable homicide by an insane person. The recorder charged the jury to—well, there are different opinions as to what the recorder wanted them to do, among those who have translated the charge from the original Greek, though his general idea seemed to be to scramble first to the support of the prisoner, and then to support of the law, and then to the prisoner again, and back again to the law, with a vaguely perceptible desire to help the prisoner a little, the most, without making that desire unofficially and ungracefully prominent. To wind up and put a final polish to the many-sided burlesque, The jury went out and devoted nearly 2 hours to trying for his life a man whose deed would not be accepted as a capital crime by the mass of mankind, even though all the lawyers did their best to prove it such. It is hardly worth while to mention that the emotional scene in the courtroom, following the delivery of the verdict, when women hugged the prisoner, the jury, the reporters, and even the remorselessly sentimental Graham, is eminently unburlesquable. But first and last, the splendid feature of the McFarland comedy was the insanity part of it. Where the occasion was for dragging in that poor old threadbare lawyer trick is not perceptible, except it was to make a show of difficulty in winning a verdict that would have won itself without even a lawyer to meddle with the case. Heaven knows insanity was disreputable enough, long ago, but now that the lawyers have got to cutting every gallows rope and picking every prisoner lock with it, it has become a sneaking villainy that ought to hang, and keep on hanging its sudden possessors until evildoers should conclude that the safest plan was to never claim to have it until they came by it legitimately. The very caliber of the people the lawyers most frequently try to save by the insanity subterfuge ought to laugh the plea out of the courts, one would think. Any one who watched the proceedings closely in the McFarland-Richardson mockery will believe that the insanity plea was a rather far-fetched compliment to pay the prisoner, inasmuch as one must first have brains before he can go crazy, and there was surely nothing in the evidence to show that McFarland had enough of the raw material to justify him in attempting anything more imposing than a lively form of idiocy. Governor Alcorn of Mississippi recommends his legislature to so alter the laws that as soon as the insanity plea is offered in the case of a person accused of crime, the case shall be sent up to a high state court and the insanity part of the matter inquired into and settled permanently, by itself, before the trial for the crime charged is touched at all. Anybody but one of this latter-day breed of lunatics on trial for murder will recognize the wisdom of the proposition at a glance. There is one other thing which transcends the powers of burlesque, and that is a Fenian invasion. First, we have the portentous mystery that precedes it for 6 months, when all the air is filled with stage whisperings, when councils meet every night with awful secrecy, and the membership try to see who can get up first in the morning and tell the proceedings. Next, the expatriated nation struggles through a travail of national squabbles and political splits, and is finally delivered of a litter of governments, and Presidents McThis, and Generals O'-that, of several different complexions, politically speaking, and straightway the newspapers teem with the new names, and men who were insignificant and obscure one day find themselves great and famous the next. Then the several governments, and presidents and generals and senates get by the ears, and remain so until the customary necessity of carrying the American city elections with a minority vote comes around and unites them. Then they begin to "sound the tocsin of war" again. That is to say, in solemn whisperings at dead of night they secretly plan a Canadian raid, and publish it in the World next morning. They begin to refer significantly to Ridgeway, and we reflect bodingly that there is no telling how soon that slaughter may be repeated. Presently the invasion begins to take tangible shape, and as no news travels so freely or so fast as the secret doings of the Fenian Brotherhood, the land is shortly in a tumult of apprehension. The telegraph announces that last night 400 men went north from Utica, but refused to disclose their destination, were extremely reticent, answered no questions, were not armed or in uniform, but it was noticed that they marched to the depot in military fashion, and so on. 50 such dispatches follow each other within 2 days, evidencing that squads of locomotive mystery have gone north from 100 different points and rendezvoused on the Canadian border, and that, consequently, a horde of 25,000 invaders, at least, is gathered together, and then, hurrah, they cross the line! Hurrah, they meet the enemy! Hip, hip, hurrah! A battle ensues! Hip, no, not hip nor hurrah, for the U.S. Marshal and one man seize the Fenian General-in-Chief on the battlefield in the midst of his army, and bowl him off in a carriage and lodge him in a common jail, and presto, the illustrious invasion is at an end. The Fenians have not done many things that seem to call for pictorial illustration, but their first care has usually been to make a picture of any performance of theirs that would stand it as soon as possible after its achievement, and paint everything in it a violent green, and embellish it with harps and pickaxes and other emblems of national grandeur, and print thousands of them in the severe simplicity of primitive lithography, and hang them above the national palladium among the decanters. Shall we have a nice picture of the Battle of Pigeon Hill and the little accident to the Commander-in-Chief? No, a Fenian invasion cannot be burlesqued, because it uses up all the material itself. It is harmless fun, this annual masquerading toward the border, but America should not encourage it, for the reason that it may some time or other succeed in embroiling the country in a war with a friendly power, and such an event as that would be ill compensated by the liberation of even so excellent a people as the down-trodden nation. The Galaxy, July 1870. Memoranda by Mark Twain. A daring attempt at a solution of it. The Fenian invasion failed because George Francis Train was absent. There was no lack of men, arms, or ammunition, but there was sad need of Mr. Train's organizing power, his coolness and caution, his tranquillity, his strong good sense, his modesty and reserve, his secrecy, his taciturnity, and above all his frantic and bloodthirsty courage. Mr. Train and his retiring and diffident private secretary were obliged to be absent, though the former must certainly have been lying at the point of death, else nothing could have kept him from hurrying to the front, and offering his heart's best blood for the downtrodden people he so loves, so worships, so delights to champion. He must have been in a disabled condition, else nothing could have kept him from invading Canada at the head of his children. And indeed this modern Samson, solitary and alone, with his formidable jaw, would have been a more troublesome enemy than 5 times the Fenians that did invade Canada, because they could be made to retire, but G.F. would never leave the field while there was an audience before him, either armed or helpless. The invading Fenians were wisely cautious, knowing that such of them as were caught would be likely to hang. But the champion would have stood in no such danger. There is no law, military or civil, for hanging persons afflicted in his particular way. He was not present, alas, save in spirit. He could not and would not waste so fine an opportunity, though, to send some ecstatic lunacy over the wires, and so he wound up a ferocious telegram with this: "With vengeance steeped in wormwood's gall, damned old England, say we all. And keep your powder dry. George Francis Train, Sherman House, Chicago, noon Thursday, May 26th. P.S. Just arrived and addressed Grand Fenian meeting in Fenian Armory, donating $50. This person could be made really useful by roosting him on some Hatteras lighthouse or other prominence where storms prevail, because it takes so much wind to keep him going that he probably moves in the midst of a dead calm wherever he travels." The Galaxy, July 1870. Memoranda by Mark Twain. To correspondents: To those parties who have offered to send me curious obituaries, I would say that I shall be very glad to receive such. A number have already been sent me. The quaint epitaph business has had a fair share of attention in all generations, but the village obituaries, those marvelous combinations of ostentatious sorrow and ghastly fine writing, have been unkindly neglected. Inquirers are informed that the post-mortem poetry of last month really came, without alteration, from the Philadelphia Ledger. The deaths have long been a prominent feature in the Ledger. Those 6 or 8 persons who have written me from various localities, inquiring with a deal of anxiety if I am permanently engaged to write for the Galaxy, have been surprised, maybe, at the serene way in which I let the days go by without making any sort of reply. Do they suppose that I am one of that kind of birds that can be walked up to and captured by the process of putting salt on its tail? Hardly. These people want to get me to say yes, and then stop their magazine. The subscriber was not fledged yesterday. End of Section 114.